Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to First Things. We are so excited that you're here today. It's a very special day. First of all, I want to say Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers that are here, to the two that are with me. Happy Mother's Day. What a very special honor it is to be here on this special occasion as mothers. I'm excited about our topic today. I'm excited that this month we are talking about apostolic heritage. We're leading up to Pentecost Sunday and where we come from and how that heritage has impacted us. And today we're going to really get into some really awesome questions. Just a reminder, if you have any questions while we're talking, they're going to put the information on the screen. You can scan the QR code. You can email us. You can go to the app. Multiple different ways that you could submit questions to make sure that if there's something specific you'd like to know, if we get to it, and we'd be happy to answer that for you. Deuteronomy 6:4-9 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord your God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and thou shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets before thine eyes. And thou shalt write them on the post of thy house and on the gates." These verses in Deuteronomy underscore the purpose of our first things during this month of May. We are discussing apostolic heritage. And heritage is defined as something that is handed down from the past as a tradition, and of late, Pastor has been referring to our church, thankfully, as a generational church. Our desire is for this great truth to be handed down from generation to generation as long as the Lord tarries. And today, I'm so honored to welcome Sister Claudine and Sister Kristen. This is our second time together to discuss the value of what has been handed down to us as generational apostolics and the desire to continue to pass that down to our children. Welcome, ladies. I'm so excited that you're here. This is our second time being together, so I think this is just our new norm. Every time I'm up here, you're up here. No, I won't put that pressure on her. But yes, the Kristens reunite again. And Claudine, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to just jump right into it. All of us here have what we were just referring to as apostolic heritage, meaning that our parents, grandparents, some of us further back than that, were in the apostolic truth. They passed that down to us. And we have the invaluable, I guess, honor of having that heritage. And so tell us a little bit about what it looked like growing up for you in the church, and what was your experience like through your childhood and in your teens. Anybody want to volunteer to go first?
Okay, I'll go. So my parents are actually first generation apostolic. So my mom, she found the church as like a 12 or 13-year-old girl. She was attending with one of her girlfriends and her mom. So she would go every Sunday. She was a part of the group of kids who would go door knocking on Saturdays to get the kids to come to church, and then she'd ride the van to pick them up the next day. And then my dad, he was in the Navy, and he was brought up Catholic.
Okay.
But he got in the Navy, and he did some soul searching and was just curious about things. And so he started praying and reading the Bible and just doing some research. And he wanted to know two things. Who is God, and what do we need to do to be saved?
Okay.
So through his research and prayer and reading, it was revealed to him. And so there was a guy on his ship that was known for being a really faithful person. And so he went to him and said, "Is there a church around here that you can be baptized in Jesus' name?" And he was like, "My church does that."
That's awesome.
So he's like, "Well, take me there, right? I want to go, like, right now." So they went, and the pastor was like, "It's not a coincidence that you're here right now, because our church is actually in the middle of a revival."
Okay.
And he's like, "I want you to stay for service." So he stayed for service. He was baptized that night and continued going to that church the rest of the time he was on the West Coast.
I love that.
Through the UPC directory, when he was finished, he made his way home and found a church back home, which is the one that my mom was attending. he became very involved. He was a trustee in the church. The location that they met at, that's not the location I was born into.
Okay.
That they bought a property. My dad helped them build the church.
Wow.
Very involved. Then the Search for Truth Bible Study was introduced.
Okay.
They started teaching home Bible studies. This is where I kind of enter in. So my growing up, I was very much, with them when they would do their Bible studies. We'd travel to houses, whatever. We were at the church all the time, just whatever needed to be done, we were there. I was
That's
just
right.
there with my parents while they were doing it. During that time, it was absolutely instilled in me, who God was,
Yeah.
the oneness of God, what salvation looked like. It was a norm for me. My parents, actually, the pastor, you guys probably know Charity Gal. I think I've told you this before. It's actually her grandfather's church is
I
the
love
church
that.
that
Yeah,
we were
okay.
going to. And my dad, one of the Bible studies he taught was to her dad,
Wow.
who now is the
Is
pastor
the
of that
pastor.
church. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, we left there, for personal reasons. Some stuff happened and found another church that was an independent church,
Okay.
still apostolic, just not associated, and continued our journey there. Again, still very involved. My mom was teaching Sunday school. She was in the choir. So they were both very involved. So I, as a child, was very
That's
involved.
Right. You were voluntold.
I was just voluntold, yeah. So that took me till about my preteen years or a little bit before that.
Okay. So rich in heritage from the very beginning. And I love that your parents individually, collectively came together through church
Yeah.
and that built that relationship and then founded family there.
Yeah.
I love that. Sister Claudine?
Sure. So I would say I wasn't raised in church, but I was raised with a backdrop of a grandmother that went to church. So I'm actually fifth generation. So my grandmother's parents
Wow.
and grandparents also
That's
were in the
awesome.
church. My grandmother is amazing. You guys have met her, and she's been here before. She actually left the church in her 20s and then came back to church in her mid-30s. But she would always tell us stories. There's a story that I think she told when you and Pastor were at my house where she was literally in a car accident. They were out preaching, and car accident happened, and they just sort of left her on the side of the road. The ambulance, the EMTs thought that she was dead, and they were working on the youth pastor that she was with, his wife, and he said, no, you need to go see about Claudine. And we have the same name. And so they did. They went and they saw, and they were like, no, she's dead. And she's not dead. So she's always told us stories about the things that God has done, and I remember that very deeply. My dad is Catholic, and my mom, we didn't go to church. We went to Catholic school, mostly because that's what you do if you live in New Orleans. Everyone sort of goes to Catholic school. And then when my parents separated when I was 8, we moved in with my grandparents. So me, my mom, my sister lived with them. And my dad, at that point, needed to clean up his life. And so he started going to church. So it was a way for me to see my dad, because we lived with my mom during the week. So I would go and I would get to see him. And then just sort of things as the years went by, the pastor, brother and sister Lawler, their youngest daughter was dating, and she would watch us in the summer, so we would chaperone her dates. And we were just really, even though my mom wasn't in church, we were just really connected to the pastor and the pastor's wife and to their family. And so then I asked my mom if I could get baptized, and my mom said, yeah, you can get baptized. So I did. So I was baptized because I really just enjoyed that. And Julie, who's still one of my friends, she's a couple years older than me, but she was in the church, and so it was cool that I got to come out with this girl that was a couple years older than me. And anyway, Julie and her mom would pick me up on the way to church. A couple of years went by, and then my mom got the Holy Ghost. I think it was right before I turned 12. And my grandmother sort of picked us up from summer camp or whatever and was like, your mom got the Holy, my grandma was so excited to tell us. And it was really cool. And from there, just church was a part of our life. We did, I remember our vacations were Little Rock, Arkansas camp meeting and Baton Rouge camp meeting. That's just how we grew up. We were always at the church, had a really strong, powerful youth group. And so we were always together and always in church. And so that was just kind of how it was.
Yeah, I love that. That's how my memories are too, just full of childhood, just togetherness. And that's the beautiful thing about generational churches and generational experiences is you grow up with your friends, and now their babies are growing up together. And yes, all the camps, all the work days, all the activities that went into behind the scene kind of stuff of church and being a part of that. I love that. So at what age, because I know that there was a period, at what age did you kind of walk away? I know there was a season. And can you kind of tell us a little bit about that season that you decided, you know what, I'm going to just take a break. I'm going to walk away for a little bit, and what that kind of looked like for you?
So we left, even though we left the church did not leave our home, if that makes sense. Like, I still very much was raised with that background, like the oneness of God, what it takes for your salvation, the importance of your walk with him. Like, my dad and my mom, they were always just preaching to us, teaching us, and that never went away. I would say as a teenager, like my later teenage years, that was still in my ear, but I was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to go hang out with my friends. It wasn't really a priority for me. I just didn't want to be so serious about it. Like, I had all that time where I saw my parents being so serious and driven and focused. And as a teenager, I just was like, I just want to go have fun and like not think about this. I don't know. So I was not a bad kid, but I wasn't making choices that would, but Brother Dillingham said it last week, like, the most important thing always should be, was what you're doing pleasing to God? Was I doing things that were pleasing to God? Probably not. Not a terrible kid, but just not in it.
So you heard it, you were around it, you witnessed it, you just weren't deciding and claiming it that this is what I want to do in this moment right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I was 17, 18, I started dating a boy who attended church but wasn't in church. And unfortunately, contrary to my pastor's want for me and for my life, I didn't really listen and wasn't submitting to the will of God, and got married. And it was a physically and emotionally abusive relationship that I stayed in for many years. And so when I was about 21, almost 22, I just couldn't anymore. I basically went to a doctor, and he said, whatever's causing you this much stress in your life, if you don't leave it today, you're going to start losing your hair, and I really don't know what else is going to happen to you. And so I was like, okay, this is it. I have to leave this situation. And so I left the situation. I was living in San Diego at the time, so my family was not there. I was there by myself, just me and my husband. And I just stopped going to church. A person in the church told me that they felt like I should stay and I should just pray about it. And we had been going to counseling with our pastor and pastor's wife, and I felt like I had to just leave. I couldn't just stay. So someone asked me later if I was upset with God. I wasn't upset with God. God didn't do that to me. I made choices that put me in that situation. It had nothing to do with God. I just needed to walk away and figure out what was next, and I couldn't be in a place where he was still attending that church or anything like that. And so that's when I stepped away.
Yeah, and I hate that you had to go through that circumstance, but I think that through counsel, I think that when there tough decisions need to be made for our sanity, for our health, for whatever, then that's when we do listen to wise counsel in our lives. We're leading into the question that talks about while you were away from God. We all have, even moments, I think that even all of us in this building can kind of attest that even though may have always been in church, we may not have given ourselves completely and had moments where we've stepped back a little bit and allowed our flesh to control our desires. But even in those moments, for the ones that have maybe not completely walked away, were you experiencing or feeling God? Because you had praying moms, you had praying grandmas that were never stopped praying and covering you. When you weren't dedicated like you wanted to be, were you feeling those prayers? Were you feeling that drawing from God? Were you knowing that someday there might be that possibility that, you know what, for a season, but when I'm ready? What was your experience in that area?
Absolutely. Like, all the time. Anytime I made a bad decision, I always had a voice inside of me, always saying, like, that's not right. Don't do that. I just always had something inside of me that knew the direction I needed to be going on and was definitely trying to steer that. I think I said last time, when I got into my 20s, I remember like a distinct conversation, like being drawn, and I'm like, I'm not ready right now, God, like, but don't give up on me because I'm going to come back. I'm just not ready to be serious about it right now, and just don't give up on me. And I mean, he didn't, but
Thankfully.
yeah, but yeah, I felt that tug all the time, that I had just had a voice in me constantly.
Yeah. And were your parents, I know my mom probably would have been too, like, hey, I'm praying for you. Like, I'm praying for you. Don't give up on God. Were they reminders, like, physically as well, like, talking to you about it?
That whole time, the teaching and preaching never stopped. Everything, every life lesson, everything happening in the world, in my life, like anything, it was all brought back to God. It was always brought back to Scripture. It was always met, my lesson from my parents was met with Scripture backup, always, and that never ceased. And
which I love that, because it's not just my opinion. Like, you can go to the Word and see it for yourself, and this is how we live. I love that. And what was your kind of experience with that tugging?
Yeah, so I don't think that, well, I know for a fact, any conversation that I ever had with my grandmother, she would say, Claudia, you need to go back to church. It didn't even matter if we talked 3 times in a day. That's how she ended her phone calls. In fact, every birthday card I have, she has that written in, like, when are you going to turn your life back over to God? It's always there. It's just who she is. I think my mom was more like, I'm praying for you, but would like hang back a little bit, whereas my grandmother was a little more in your face around it. But it happened all the time. Like, I think just like you said, I sort of always knew that at some point I would turn back to this. It was just like when. And there are lots of moments in my life, but particularly with my kids, I actually tease my grandmother, and I call it teasing. I tell her that she's like Job. It's like God has this hedge around her and our family. Thankfully, she hasn't had the like things being taken away that Job had.
Right.
But the good part,
the good part.
she's had, because like things have happened to us that could have been so much worse than they were. It's like God didn't let them get as bad as they could, and I know that that's because of her. When I was pregnant with Eli, I had kidney stones, and we had an ultrasound, and probably the worst thing that could have happened to us, it was a friend of ours that was the tech doing the ultrasound, and so she says, there's something with your baby, but I can't tell you.
Oh, my
Well, that's
word.
great.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what
I'm
that means.
totally calm. I'm totally peaceful right now.
I don't know what's happening.
No stress here.
Right, and so we like go back upstairs because we're in the ER, and we're like, well, certainly you guys can tell us what's wrong with our baby. And they were like, no, geneticist has to call you sometime later this week. And so we really went through this point in time where we weren't sure if Eli had Down syndrome or not, and that's really where we were. And I remember like asking my grandma to pray, and I was talking to my grandfather, and my grandfather was not in church. Thanks to the goodness of the Lord, my grandfather got saved days before he passed.
I love that.
And that's really because of the prayers of my grandmother. I 100% believe that. But he said to me, he said, Claude, Mama already said it's okay. Like, stop worrying. It is fine. And he just kind of had that confidence with my grandmother. And I just, Pastor, you always say, like, exceedingly abundantly above all you can ever ask or think. And that's something that means something to me, because there's a message by Sister Rita Dawson that she preaches. It probably happened in the 80s.
Right.
But my grandmother listened to it on tape so much that when I was a kid, like, it has stuck with me, this idea of exceedingly abundantly above all we can ever ask or think. And I just remember it. It was just part of my childhood. And it's happened, in our family so many times. When in 2012, Chuck had to have quadruple bypass surgery, and it was really scary. I was 30 years old. I had a 1-year-old. I had an almost 3-year-old.
Wow.
And you're hearing that your husband's widowmaker is like 89% blocked, and you're like, and that's just one of 5. And so it was just really scary, and I just remember like asking my family to pray. And I remember turning to their prayers often, and so I really felt like I couldn't pray, so I would ask them to pray for me. And in 2014, Maddie started getting fevers, and this child would have a fever for 10 days, but no other symptoms, and we couldn't figure it out. And I remember asking my sister to pray. We had like seen a cardiologist. We had seen infectious diseases. The infectious disease doctor said she is one of several, like, she has a periodic fever syndrome. It's one of these, like, tell me the next time it spikes again and come in and we'll figure it out. And so we felt like he was going to give us answers, but we didn't know what they were. And I remember asking my sister to pray for me, and my sister said, she pointed back to a camp meeting, a message that we had heard at Little Rock called God's Regular Customers. And she said, I can pray for you because I'm one of God's regular customers. You need to be God's regular customer in your own life. Yeah. And she wasn't saying it to be mean. She was saying it because she knew that I needed to hear it. And I remember praying that night and asking God to heal Maddie and telling God that, if you heal my child, I'll come back to you. I will serve you. And unfortunately, God did heal Maddie. We never had another fever again. But I didn't come back then just because I guess I just wasn't quite ready yet. But yeah, I could always feel their prayers, and they were always a part of my life.
I love that. I absolutely love the layers and the covering. That's what it is. It's just a covering. It's a hedge of protection that when in a moment we're not capable on our own to pray on our behalf, to know that you have people, family members that love you dearly, that value you and want success, especially in this area of our lives. They are covering you. They are protecting you in that area. And what a huge testimony. Basically a gift that is given to you. So tell us about what transpired. So we go through these seasons. We're in church. We're raised in church. We walk away. You've got still testimonies of covering. You've got that drawing. You've got that tugging and pulling that says, when the time's right, you know where to come back, to come home, to come to a place of safety and security. So what transpired in your life that made you realize, okay, I've had my fun. I've done what I've wanted to do for myself. I've lived for myself for a while. Now I need to get back to God. What did that look like in your life?
So it was actually really a process for me. It did not happen overnight. I mentioned before the last time that Grayson didn't come easily. Chad and I were married for a few years, and we went through a lot. We realized it wasn't going to be in the cards for us just to start a family right away. So we were seeing doctors, and I've had many procedures. I had just a lot. It was a long process. And in that process, there was heartache and pain. It was physical pain. It was emotional pain. I'm watching all these couples around me, all these girls. I was in the education field. I'm working with all women. They're all pregnant. It's like they're getting pregnant on accident. They're getting married and getting pregnant the next week. They're having their third child. And I'm over here at the doctor every other day. I'm getting stuffed with needles. It was so much, and it was physically and emotionally draining, and I had no control over it, and I was just very, very sad. And I knew I needed to rely on something bigger. This was the doctors were helping us, but I knew that I needed to have a deeper thing to look at, and I knew that thing was God. So I just started praying, and Claudine, same thing. I didn't feel like I had a right to pray. Where have you been all this time? Who are you to ask me for something now? But I just prayed, and I'm just please bless me with a child. Just one. I just want to be pregnant one time. I just want to have one baby. And if it's not in the cards for me for whatever reason, just give me the strength to be okay with it. If it's not your will, just let me be okay with it. This went on for years. We had things happen. We thought we were pregnant. It was just awful. And it was a lot of prayer. I feel like God, in hindsight, did that on purpose. I needed to go through that because it was like he was telling me, you're going to have your family, but you're going to go through something first, because when it comes, you're going to be a different person. And eventually, we were blessed with Grayson, and he really was a miracle. We needed the doctors. They had to intervene, but I knew who to give credit to. God provided. It was all him, and that was prayer. And that, it's not a life-threatening thing, but it was something that I desired. I longed for it, and it was affecting me as a person. I was losing part of myself. He answered that prayer. Even though I wasn't around for him for that period, he was like, that's okay. I've got you. In the end, I'm going to have you. So,
which I love that, because it's almost like You knew your parents had their story and their foundation, and you grew up in that. You heard it. You heard all of it. You heard all the scriptures. You heard all the faith and the testimonies. But when you get to a certain point in your life, you kind of have to make that decision for yourself. And the only way to do that is to know that you can go back and say, it wasn't the doctors that did that.
Right.
It was God. My reconnecting with him, my putting my faith and trust. Well, trust is a long process sometimes, a waiting process of just, I'm going to trust you through all of this. And then what a testimony for you to always have a reference point.
Yeah.
This was only God.
Yeah.
I love that.
If I would have had Grayson at a different point in my life, if it would have come easily, and we're going to get to this in a minute, but if it would have happened differently, my purpose for Grayson's life might look very different if I did not have to go through this first.
So it had to start with you, obviously, as the parent, as the one knowing it had to be established in you to continue to affect him generation to generation. Sister Claudine, how did that transpire for you? What was that moment like for you?
Yeah, so for me, it really started during the pandemic, I would say. So I would say probably a little bit before that. I would say in 2019. So in 2018, the company that I worked for in November was acquired by a larger firm, and that was really stressful and a really just hard year for me professionally. I wasn't happy. Friends noticed that I wasn't happy. I remember one of my best friends, her boyfriend would say all the time, you don't smile anymore. And I'm a happy, bubbly person. So it was just really hard. And sort of that was 2019 into 2020. And I had a new boss at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And so it was just a lot of change in my personal life. In my professional life, rather. And living through the pandemic, I just felt like, oh my gosh, like time is winding up. Like you think you have all this time and you don't. And, I got to do something. And so I remember all that year of 2020 thinking, like, I need to go back to church. And what was that going to look like? And I remember just like trying to find a church that I wanted to go to. So my aunt and uncle have lived in Virginia Beach a couple times, being a military family. And most recently when they were here, they were at Pastor Hall's, and then they moved, and then he passed away. So I sort of was like trying to figure out like what church do I go to, and all that kind of stuff. And basically, I sort of decided that come January 2021, I was going to serve God, and I was going to go back to church, and like I knew that was like a thing. And I knew that Eli's birthday was the first Sunday. So I wasn't going to go that Sunday because that was Eli's birthday. I was going to go the 10th. So like I figured it out, and so I remember going back and forth with my sister, and that's it. And I remember sort of talking to Chuck about the fact that I was going to go back to church and like what was that going to mean. And he was super supportive about the whole thing. Like we view salvation differently, but we don't view how we raise our children or the fact that you should be a good human and like what that means. We don't view that differently. And so I just remember like that being a thing. I went to another local church, got the Holy Ghost in April, and then found this church sort of by like it was God. It was God because I didn't even know that my aunt was praying that God would send me to a different church. I had no idea that she was praying those prayers until I told her. But Maddie needed to meet with a tutor and do some testing. The tutor always does the testing at a local library. She said, I can't get in at the local library. Can you meet me at this Panera on Indian River? And I was like, yeah, that's fine, whatever. So we did. We went there, and then I saw the ladies were walk in. So I think Sister Taylor was there, and Rachel was there, and Destiny was there. And they were chatting, and I could tell that they were church ladies. And so I kind of like insinuated myself into their conversation. And Maddie yelled at me later. She was like, Mom, did you take over there? Like, you can't just walk up to people and talk, which I do a lot. But anyway, I walked up and talked to them, and then they told me about this church, and it was just really cool. And so I remember like asking, okay, so they gave me the details, and I was like, great, this was a Saturday, we're gonna come Sunday. And so we came Sunday morning, but I had like looked at the church's website and was like, I don't even know how I didn't see this church. Like it's so much, like it's closer to our house and everything. And I remember coming, and when I had said something to my sister way back in 2020 about finding a church, she told me I needed to go to Brother Daniel Walter's church in Chester. And I was like, that is like forever away.
That's like, a really long drive every week.
That is not a realistic suggestion. But and he was the guest speaker here that day. And I know his story because I grew up as a teen hearing his, like, we went to the Silsby church where he was from. And so it was just like, oh my God, like, God couldn't have, like, put more things in order to tell me that this was the right place for me.
I love that. He's like, here, I'm going to give you some specific details that only you'll know about to reveal to you that timing is everything, right? Timing, location, ultimately being sensitive to God. Right. And again, you got that heritage that's covering you, that's guiding you through their prayers. When you don't even know what to pray, they're praying on your behalf to get you to that place that you need to be. I absolutely love that. So the scripture tells us to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. So knowing that you wanted to return to church, the timing was right, everything had kind of lined up, now's the time. How important was it that when you decided to return to God, it wasn't just a whatever church? It had to be an apostolic church. It had to be returning back to what you knew God had instilled with you as a child. How important was that?
So this was 2019 as well, because this is when I was pregnant with Grayson. I was praying throughout my pregnancy, like, just so thankful, so blessed at this time. Like, I'm here, like, I'm going to have this baby, and you did this for me. Like, that was very impactful because it was the first time it was like I just felt like a miracle, you know? And so I'm probably going to say this later again, but I felt like at that time the way I could thank God was by committing myself and our future back to him. Like, you've gifted me with this perfect, like, I'm going to have this child and I don't want to mess it up, and he's yours. Right. You've given him to me. I don't want to mess him up. So, you know, I need to do what's right and make sure he's brought up in the church. So Chad actually, and again, God orders your steps all the way, because we were at another church, and I'm pretty sure we're talking about the same church, Claudine. We were at another church for like a brief period of time. Same thing, got the Holy Ghost there as an adult, but just didn't feel like it was something I was staying at. Now, fast forward years later, we have Grayson. Yeah. He's born. I've made this commitment. Yeah,
right. Hey, you better keep your end of the bargain, right?
I made this commitment. The pandemic hits, and my dad puts a call in, and it was basically another in my ear thing. Get it together. It was a very, just in a very authoritative way.
I love you, but like,
time.
Get going.
Yeah, it's time. Like, it's time, because I think that for a lot of people that may have been in church and then weren't in church, the pandemic was okay, like a wake-up call.
A great awakening, yeah.
You sensed that the end is near, like the time is come. There is no more time to play around. So it was like, okay, get serious. What was that going to look like? Then Chad is, for like a minute, has a job at Cintas. I mean, literally, he was there a minute. Yeah. And he's like, Kristen, never talked to him, never had a conversation with him, never on Facebook, but just happened to be scrolling. I think a guy I work with is friends with another mutual friend from the other church. I think he goes to an apostolic church. Really? Yeah. And he's like, yeah, I think so. So Chad actually initiated the conversation. And if I have to go back, not only was God ordering my steps and I had to go through a process, but I think Chad did too.
Absolutely.
So, you know, he was on his own journey at this time. He knew that I was brought up apostolic. Okay. So when Daniel, he saw that Daniel was on Facebook as this mutual friend, he struck up the conversation with him, like, hey, do you go to an apostolic church? Daniel invited us, and that's how we ended. Like, the very first time walking in here, I knew, like, my spirit, even though I had left for a time, that spirit was kicking strong. Like, I knew what felt right, and I knew that it was going to be where we stayed. After some stuff happened, then I had to take
COVID. You got
but I
we
knew
passed on a little extra that Sunday.
Yeah.
Left you with a little extra gift.
I mean, Daniel coughed, and Chad was like, he's got COVID. I'm not kidding. We went home.
Welcome to the family.
We went home, and he said Daniel was sick. Yeah, happy Valentine's Day. So, but yeah, aside from that, we knew that this was where we were going to stay. And just to piggyback on that real quick about the other church, we were looking up churches in the area.
Yeah.
We found this church, but you guys weren't here yet.
Right.
You were still at the school. Coming back, I wasn't sure. Like, I didn't know where to go. Like, I didn't want it to be awkward. The other church, I knew I could just walk in and slip in the back seat and just kind of get a feel for it. But the timing of it, if I would have come here then, I don't know if I wasn't ready for the full commitment. But God wrapped us right back around to it for that minute of a job so that Chad could meet Daniel.
So we can credit you for getting our building because he knew you needed a place to have a home. So
that's right.
Thank you, Kristen.
I wasn't coming until it was here.
He works all things for all of our good, so I appreciate that. Sister Claudine, how did that look for you? When you decided you knew it had to be an apostolic church?
So I think I always knew that I had to be in a church that believed Acts 2:38. That was just really important. I mentioned earlier going to Catholic school. Like, I've sat through Mass every Friday. I knew that there wasn't anything in that. And actually, Chuck and I would go to church with my grandmother when we were in Mississippi. We would go to church with my mom from time to time. So, like, we had been in attended churches. When we were here, when we first moved here, we actually went to Pastor Hall's a couple of times with my aunt and uncle, and I remember one specific Sunday where I think I'd been to church with Chuck before, but just sort of sat there. That day, I was praying and had raised my hands, and when we got in the car, Chuck was like, "So what happened today? You want to tell me a little bit more about that?" And then at that point in time, I remember Chuck actually saying, like, "I think we should find a church. Like, I don't really want to go to that church. It's a far drive from Virginia Beach to Suffolk. Like, I commend my aunt and uncle for doing that for as long as they did." But Chuck was like, "Let's find another church." And I remember, like, he asked, and I just didn't do anything with it because I didn't want to go to a church that wasn't an apostolic church. So I just said nothing. And so I think for me, it was just that we had to go. I had to be at the right place. I think when I was looking, though, for churches here, another thing was trying to find, like, the right kind of an apostolic church, if that makes sense. Like, I think I grew up in an independent church where, like, UPC churches were sort of didn't have the right standards. And so that was a whole thing too, trying to find the right one. I actually didn't see this church online at all, though. I remember seeing NAC, and that's it. And so it was just like trying to figure, and I knew people at the other church. Like, I knew a couple of people that went there, so it's sort of easy. It was just really big, and I'm used to a super, super tiny church.
Yeah.
Timing is everything. Panera was everything.
If I could piggyback on that with the lifting of the hands. When I was a kid, like those teenage years after we left the church, when I would have sleepovers with my girlfriends or whatever, they would attend church. My parents were open to letting me, like, wake up Sunday morning and go to service with them. Even, like, young, I still knew that wasn't the way it's supposed to be. I know of a church, I have a friend of mine who's told me, like, their church, that their pastor has actually said, like, they've had guests come in and they're like, and I know that you may come from a church where raising hands or just like a comment like that, but we don't do that here.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's not biblical.
Right.
And any church that you go to where you're being taught, like, if you have been introduced to the truth and you know what church is supposed to look like, even though I had left at, my preteen age, if it didn't feel right. None of it felt right. So going back, it definitely had to be an Acts 2:38 church.
What you knew, what triggered in your spirit. And that's I think a God-given thing as well of, like, what I've instilled in you, what has been placed in you. And that's what trained it up. So when you come back, that what is right and what is wrong. That spirit gives us confirmation, I feel. It gives us that peace that, okay, this is what I'm meant to be doing. So I thank you so much for your testimonies. You've passed down that parents, grandparents have prayed. They've passed that down to you guys, and you've depended on that on so many occasions of your life to feel those prayers and use that guidance. And so now you both have children. How does that look for you? So every person has their path. Every person has their story. Your children are going to have their story. They're going to have their own experience with God. But how does that look for you now, passing that down to them, to give them the same tools that you were given, to pass down this apostolic heritage to them and make sure that you're doing everything you can to give them the opportunities that you received? How does that look for you now with Grayson, with Eli, with Maddie?
So like I said earlier, I made this commitment now, and I had to see it through. And my commitment was like, I want to live as an example. Like my parents were an example. I want to live as an example. Am I living as an example now? Right. What do I need to adjust? Right. And I want Grayson to know that there's a God that loves him, right, and will protect him and cares for him. And I want Grayson to love God, right, and want to walk with God and know and understand what salvation looks like and strive for that himself. I want him to grow up with other kids who have the same values, right, who are going to keep those values. They're kind of going to be checkpoints for each, right, other as they get older.
Absolutely, I love that.
I just want him to know that our house is going to serve the Lord. Like, we are going to be God-fearing people, and I want him to be a God-fearing man when he grows up.
I love that.
Yeah, I think the same. I think that I'm going to get emotional, sorry. It's funny because I've talked to my aunt a lot about this and trying to be the spiritual authority for my home and for my kids. Pastor preached a message last year about the third chair, and that's really set home with me because I've been that second chair, right? And so it's like I think I agree with everything that you said, and it's trying to make sure that I'm being the best example. Like, I pray that prayer every morning, every night. Like, God, am I being a godly mother, right? Like, are they seeing God in me? And I think that's the one thing that I want for them the most. I do pray for their souls. I do pray that they'll figure it out. I do worry that they're too old, right? And if I had come to God when they were younger, would it be different? I see my sister's kids. They don't know any different. They've been in truth their whole life. And it's just very different. And so I think, it's thinking about the third chair and trying to make sure that I'm doing everything that I can to help them. I can't save them, but I can pray those prayers like my grandmother did for me. And then my mom did for me, and I'll do the same for them. Sister Brenda, I told her this morning, in her first thing, she talked about, they were talking about raising their kids, and she said, kids don't see sin the way that we see sin. And I think that that's still the same thing that I'm at with Eli and Maddie. Like, they don't view sin the way that I view it, right? And so I pray that God will sort of be in charge of their life just the way that he was in charge of mine, and it'll work itself out.
Claudine, I was just going to say, like, the earlier conversation you were saying about your process and how your age that you came in, they're kind of in that spot right now. So, look at you. You are the example because you were only 12 or 13 when you came into it, and you had seasons where you left and you were drawn back. So I think you're doing an amazing job. You're an example,
absolutely,
and they're seeing you just like you were seeing your family.
Absolutely.
I think in the long run they'll find it.
That's so true. I think that, again, we all have our own stories. We all have our points where we come to a decision. Lord, is this my time? Do I choose? Because we individually, like, I cannot get my daughter to heaven. There's nothing that I can do to get her to heaven as far as physically making that choice for her. I can't stand up before God and say, well, she's a really good girl and she's done all things right and she loves you, but like, I really just want you to bring her in with me because she's my daughter. She has to do that on her own. What you've talked about today, the example that you were given, the prayers that were prayed over you, the prayers that you, I know, are praying over your children is going to make the biggest difference in their life. Exposing them to truth, loving truth, valuing it, and making them realize that the God that saved you, loved you, even through those moments when you weren't connected to him, is the same God that loves, values them, and wants to have relationship with them. I don't see that we have any questions, which is okay, right? Yep. It's okay. But I can't thank you enough, both of you, for coming and sharing with us how vitally important it is. I don't care if this is your first service in church. I don't care if you've been in church for your entire life. Knowing that you have the body of Christ, you have the covering of layers of people that are praying for you, it's invaluable. It is literally life-changing. Yeah. It literally will transform your life. So no matter where you are today, no matter what level you're at today, the decision to say, Lord, I put myself in your hands. I want to make an influence, and I want to make a difference in somebody else's life. All you got to do is make the first step to do it. And you as mothers, you're making difference in your children's life. You're benefiting from what you received, and now you're passing that down to them. And that's all we can do. That's all we can do is live the life we know God has called us to live, to please him and instill love and truth in our children. So thank you so much for being with you. Give them a hand clap. Thank you for sharing your stories, your testimonies. We got about 15 minutes before our next service starts, so have a few minutes of break, and we will see you at 12 o'clock. Thank you so much.